The house was silent, except for the faint rattle of glass against glass, as though someone had been drinking in the dark and forgotten to put the bottle away. But when the investigators pulled open the ballroom doors of the Belgrave estate in 1912, what they found was not forgotten wine. It was bone. 13 human skeletons, seated neatly around a dining table, their hollow eyes turned toward the head of the room where a velvet chair sat empty, waiting for its host. That host was Eleanor Belgrave, the heiress whispered about in hushed tones across New York's upper circles. They said she never smiled in public, that her shadow seemed longer than her body, that when she shook hands you felt more chilled than touched. No one imagined that her wealth, drawn from railroads, coal, and bloodline contracts, had been guarded by more than lawyers. The skeletons were not strangers. They were all linked to her family's fortune. And one by one, they had vanished from the world without a sound. Tonight, you will learn what the newspapers were forbidden to print. Tonight, we descend into the labyrinth of power, secrecy, and a ballroom that became a tomb. Stay with me because what waits beyond this door is not just her story. It's a reflection of everything you were told not to notice. Eleanor was not born a monster. She was born into the cold machinery that makes monsters. The Belgrave family traced its line back to England's black nobility, merchants who sold arms to both sides of wars and financed kings who turned against their own people. By the time she was 6 years old, Eleanor was being taught not nursery rhymes but Latin incantations of legal ownership, how contracts enslave generations, how debts make invisible chains. Her governess was not a gentle teacher but a handler, conditioning her to associate wealth with sacrifice and obedience with silence. She would be shown a tenant farmer, thin and shaking, then taught, "This is what happens when one forgets their place." These lessons carved her soul into two halves, one half fragile child, the other forged steel. And when she inherited the Belgrave fortune at 17, she also inherited the expectation, protect the wealth by any means. That ballroom would soon become her theater of control, her private altar, and her prison. But here is the first hook. The skeletons weren't random victims. Each one had signed their name into a Belgrave ledger. Each one thought they were protected by wealth, when in truth they had already been marked for burial. The first disappearance was in 1889. Eleanor was 22, newly returned from Europe after what society believed was a finishing tour. In reality, it was an initiation. She had studied the estates of Europe's forgotten houses, places where power did not reside in parliaments or crowns, but in hidden rooms where men in robes drew maps of empire. She returned home carrying secrets no heiress should know. Within a month, a family trustee named Richard Alcott vanished. His carriage was found overturned in the Hudson River, but his body was never recovered. Gossip papers claimed he drowned, but whispers in New York salons spoke differently. Eleanor had been seen at the docks that night, wearing gloves that gleamed even in the dark. 2 years later, another trustee disappeared. Then another. Each time, their fortunes reverted back into Belgrave control. And each time, Eleanor hosted a small, private dinner in her ballroom, with one fewer guest in attendance. These dinners became ritual. 13 chairs, 13 glasses, but always one seat that would never be filled again. The house staff claimed they heard music at midnight when no one was invited. They said Eleanor would speak to the empty seats as though they answered. But the real horror is this: their remains were never buried. They remained inside that room, kept as trophies. Wealth consolidated through bone. Why did no one stop her? Because to stop Eleanor Belgrave was to stop the system itself. Her family's wealth was woven into the foundations of New York: railroads, steel, banking. Judges sat in her dining room, mayors kissed her gloved hand, and priests blessed her dinners. Even when suspicions grew, nothing could pierce the armor of silence. And Eleanor understood something darker still. Fear is not created by violence alone. Fear is created when the truth is visible but no one dares to name it. Every guest who entered her ballroom saw the grand chandelier, the mirrored walls, the polished floor, but never the trapdoor beneath the stage where bones were lowered one by one. The skeletons were not hidden as shame, but kept as mirrors for anyone who thought of betrayal. Each ivory grin was a contract written in silence. And here is the secret most people refuse to face. Eleanor's ballroom is not unique. Every empire has its skeletons seated at invisible tables. Every institution protects its fortune by sacrificing the few who resist. We look at her and think, monster. But in truth, she was only obeying the laws written in shadow centuries before she was born. As the disappearances grew, so did the legends. Servants swore Eleanor never slept in a bed but sat upright in her ballroom chair, watching her skeletal guests as if waiting for them to whisper advice. Some claimed she aged slower than other women, that while her contemporaries wrinkled, her skin remained porcelain, her hair black as raven wings. There were rumors of a doctor who injected her with strange serums distilled from the marrow of the dead. Others believed she had made a pact, wealth eternal, in exchange for binding 13 souls to her estate. What we do know is this: Eleanor's grip on power did not weaken with scandal. It grew. People leaned closer to her, terrified but addicted, like moths circling a flame they could never escape. Newspapers avoided her name. Police records vanished. Witnesses recanted. And yet the skeletons remained, silent proof locked behind ballroom doors. What the world could not see was the deeper truth. Eleanor was not collecting bodies. She was collecting silence. And silence, more than gold or steel, is the currency of control. The real question is not how she kept 13 skeletons. The real question is, who taught her that this was the way power survives? Eleanor did not invent the ballroom ritual. She inherited fragments of it from something far older. Her journals, recovered decades later but swiftly locked in private archives, contain sketches of circular tables carved with alchemical symbols, diagrams of seating positions, and Latin phrases translating to, "The living must dine with the dead," or "The dead is never paid." These writings link her to a shadow society known only as the Sepulchre Circle, an elite order rumored to convene in Europe during the Black Death. The Circle's philosophy was brutal. By dining in the presence of the dead, the living could renew contracts of loyalty and harvest spiritual strength from fear itself. Imagine being 20 years old, suddenly holding an empire's wealth, and being handed not advice but instructions to bind yourself through ritual. Eleanor wasn't improvising. She was executing a blueprint handed down like a sacred will. This is where the story begins to fracture. Because if Eleanor's ballroom was only her madness, the secret dies with her. But if she was enacting a rite practiced by rulers across centuries, then every chandelier, every grand estate, may hold echoes of a feast where silence became currency and bone became ledger. The servants who remained loyal tell us the truth in fragments, their testimonies hidden in police files that vanished after 1 week. They said Eleanor began her dinners with laughter, telling jokes to empty seats as though the missing trustees still answered. But as the night dragged, the mood shifted. She would raise a glass, whisper a Latin vow, and the air in the room turned heavy, as though even oxygen obeyed her. Then came the music. Not from musicians, but from a phonograph that played strange compositions no one recognized, filled with chords that bent and twisted the ear. Afterward, she always descended to the trapdoor, carrying one object from her skeletal guests: a ring, a cane, a pocket watch. These tokens were stored in a locked cabinet that no maid was allowed to touch. If anyone disobeyed, they disappeared. By 1897, 3 house servants had vanished along with the trustees. The staff stopped asking questions. The neighbors stopped wondering about the missing. Eleanor had built not only a house of wealth but a fortress of silence. And here lies the deeper hook. Silence does not just protect secrets, it creates dependency. People feel safer not knowing. And the moment they prefer not to know, the monster has already won. Her power peaked in 1901, when the Belgrave estate hosted a masked gala for the city's highest elites. Guests wore velvet masks, drank wine older than their grandparents, and marveled at Eleanor's grandeur. But beneath the floorboards of the ballroom, 13 skeletons sat in silent attendance. The gala photographs that survive show Eleanor radiant, her mask feathered like black wings, her gaze unwavering. Yet if you zoom closely, you'll notice her hand signals, strange gestures as though invoking something mid-conversation. These were not casual motions. They matched gestures used by occult societies across Europe, signs of binding and sealing. One banker who attended later confessed, under heavy drink, that he saw more than a party. He claimed Eleanor whispered promises of eternal protection, if her guests would pledge loyalty not just to her, but to the ones seated in silence below. Within 6 months, that banker's assets quietly shifted under Belgrave control. He signed the contract willingly. This is the point that shakes us most. By then, Eleanor no longer needed to kill to control. She had weaponized the skeletons as symbols. She showed her guests the price of betrayal and made loyalty their only safe harbor. Skeletons were no longer corpses. They were contracts. But power always bleeds into paranoia. In 1906, a fire broke out in one wing of the Belgrave estate. Firefighters arrived quickly, but Eleanor refused them entry to the ballroom. Witnesses saw her standing at the doors, screaming, "They must not be disturbed." The flames stopped short of that room as though the fire itself bowed in obedience. Yet after the fire, something in her changed. She rarely appeared in public. Curtains remained drawn even at midday. Those who did glimpse her claimed her hair had streaked white overnight, her hands trembling though her voice remained steady. And here the whispers darken. Some said the skeletons had moved. That during the fire, one was found shifted from its chair, its bony hand stretched toward the velvet throne. Eleanor, they say, locked herself in the ballroom for 3 days afterward. When she emerged, she declared a new rule. No one, not servant nor guest, would ever again enter the ballroom without her invitation. From that moment forward, the ballroom was not just her altar. It became her fortress. Yet here's the paradox. Fortresses don't keep you safe. They keep you trapped. And the more Eleanor sealed herself inside, the more the walls began to whisper. By 1910, Eleanor was 53, yet photographs still show a woman who looked no older than 30. Her preservation sparked new rumors that she had found a way to siphon time itself, feeding off the silence of her skeletal congregation. A physician once summoned to the estate wrote in a private letter, "Her pulse was steady, her eyes sharp, but the room in which she received me was unbearable. I felt as though I was intruding upon a council of the dead." That letter was confiscated by authorities, but not before a copy survived in a private archive. Eleanor had achieved something few dare whisper. She had blurred the line between death and governance. She was ruling not just with money, not just with fear, but with a metaphysical contract none could fully understand. And yet, every chain eventually strains. People began to notice inconsistencies, the missing trustees, the vanished servants, the eerie silence around Belgrave affairs. A small group of journalists prepared to expose her in 1912. They would sneak into the estate, open the forbidden ballroom and reveal the truth. What they found would never be printed in the press. What they saw would leave one of them blind, another mute, and the third dead within a month. Because the ballroom held more than skeletons. It held proof that silence itself can consume the living. The journalists entered through the servants' passage just after midnight. They expected dust, cobwebs, the stillness of an unused room. Instead, they found candles burning fresh, their wax dripping in patterns across the floor like deliberate trails. The chandeliers swayed though no window was open. At the center, the table remained set, crystal glasses filled to the brim with dark liquid, as though the guests had only stepped away moments before. The skeletons sat upright, heads tilted, jaws agape in permanent mockery of speech. The youngest journalist, Thomas Kerr, dared to step closer. He reached for one goblet and froze. The wine inside rippled though his hand had not touched it. That was the moment they realized they were not intruding upon stillness. They were interrupting something still in motion. The second journalist, Eleanor Hughes, swore she heard whispers circling the chandelier like moths. She called them voices stitched from the silence itself. They tried to retreat, but the doors had locked behind them. Only when the third journalist struck the window with a chair did the glass shatter and release them into the night. What they carried with them was not just fear. It was infection, an imprint of the silence that would gnaw at their lives until each one was erased. Within weeks, the journalists began to fall apart. Thomas Kerr lost his sight overnight. Doctors found no cause. His eyes were intact, but his vision was gone. Eleanor Hughes could not speak, her vocal cords seemingly paralyzed though her body remained otherwise healthy. The third, Robert Dwyer, began coughing blood. He died before spring. Their notes, however, survived. In them they described not just skeletons but movement. They swore the bones had shifted as though straining against invisible strings, trying to rise from their chairs. One note contained a line that chills even the most hardened historian: "She does not dine with the dead. She dines through them." That note was intercepted by police, sealed in a vault, then lost in an archival fire 2 years later. But the pattern remains. Anyone who came too close to Eleanor's truth was silenced. By blindness, by muteness, by death. This is not coincidence. This is the mathematics of power. Knowledge forbidden does not just hide. It retaliates. And when silence is the weapon, every attempt to reveal it tightens the noose. Ask yourself, how many truths in your own world vanished the same way, not disproved, not debunked, but devoured by silence itself? The Belgrave estate became a paradox in the years following. Outwardly, Eleanor withdrew from society, declining galas, refusing interviews, rarely seen in public. Yet her influence did not wane, it multiplied. Laws were quietly altered in her favor. Railroads granted her permanent rights of passage. Banks forgave debts. Even politicians who never met her spoke her name with caution, as if invoking a sovereign power. How could a woman who appeared so absent exert such control? Because Eleanor had mastered the greatest illusion of all, to make absence itself an authority. People feared her silence more than they feared her presence. The ballroom became a symbol, not because anyone saw it but because they knew it was there. Its very existence whispered, "You are replaceable, you are fragile, you are one decision away from being another skeleton in a velvet chair." This was the deeper architecture of control. Eleanor did not need to speak threats. She only needed people to imagine them. And what the mind imagines in fear is always more terrifying than what the hand can enforce. That is why dictators, corporations, even religions borrow from her playbook. They build rooms you will never enter, doors you cannot open, and they let your imagination complete the terror. But cracks always appear, even in fortresses built of silence. In 1912, whispers emerged of a 13th skeleton that had not belonged to a trustee. A maid claimed it was a woman, slighter bones, jewelry still clinging to the wrist. Who was she? A rival? A confidant? Perhaps even a lover? Theories multiplied. Some said it was Eleanor's own sister, Catherine, who vanished mysteriously in 1893. If true, then the story shifts from calculated power to something far more personal. Eleanor had not just sacrificed strangers. She had sacrificed blood. This revelation, if exposed, would have toppled her empire. And perhaps she knew it. Because shortly after these whispers spread, the maid who spoke them vanished. Her body was never found. Her name was struck from the estate records. But the rumor survived because truth, like silence, echoes even when voices are extinguished. If the 13th skeleton was indeed Catherine, then Eleanor was not simply enacting a family inheritance. She was sealing her own family line with bone. The heiress who inherited everything left nothing behind, except a ballroom that whispered like a tomb and a legacy too dangerous to speak aloud. By autumn of that same year, a new force finally moved against her. It was not the police, not the newspapers, not the neighbors. It was her own kin, distant cousins who had long resented her control of the Belgrave fortune. They gathered lawyers, pressed judges, and demanded an official inquest. But when they arrived at the estate, Eleanor did not resist. She invited them inside. She led them into the ballroom herself, dressed in mourning black though no one had died that week. The cousins laughed, thinking she had weakened. But once the doors closed, the chandelier began to sway, the glasses on the table trembled, and the skeletons shifted in their chairs. One cousin screamed. Another fainted. By dawn, 3 of them had signed away their claims to the Belgrave fortune, their signatures still preserved in sealed archives today. Eleanor had staged her final demonstration. She did not kill them. She showed them the price of disobedience and let them destroy themselves. That is how the Belgrave Empire survived untouched for another decade. And that is why Eleanor's ballroom still matters, not as a story of madness but as a blueprint. Because when you realize what she built, you begin to see its reflection in every system you live under today. The cousins never spoke publicly again, but behind closed doors they tried to unravel Eleanor's stranglehold. Private investigators were hired, archives were searched, and occult scholars were consulted. One name surfaced repeatedly: the Sepulchre Circle. Evidence suggested that Eleanor's family had been inducted generations earlier, and she was not just preserving a fortune, she was safeguarding a covenant. The investigators claimed that the skeletons were arranged in positions identical to the circle's ritual tables, where the living and the dead sat as equal participants in a banquet of silence. The idea was that fear, obedience, and secrecy could be harvested as an energy, binding wealth to bloodline across centuries. Whether one believes this or not, the results are undeniable. Eleanor's estate not only survived the Great Panic of 1907, it thrived. While banks collapsed, her assets doubled. While others scrambled, she stood untouchable, untouched, untouching. And here lies the haunting truth. History is full of families who grow stronger in collapse. They aren't lucky. They aren't blessed. They are protected by rules most of us were never meant to see. Eleanor was not an outlier. She was a glimpse behind the curtain. By 1915, the world was changing. War tore across Europe. Empires shook. But the Belgrave estate stood untouched, the ballroom sealed. Eleanor appeared only once that year, photographed in mourning black again though no family death was reported. Observers remarked that she looked younger than ever, her skin luminous, her posture unyielding. Rumors spread that she had found a way to siphon vitality itself, draining those bound to her through the skeletons. A surviving letter from a priest describes his visit to the estate. I felt a chill in my marrow as though something beneath the floorboards were pulling me hollow. He begged the church to intervene, but no one answered. And here is where I ask you watching this now, if you had stood in that ballroom with 13 skeletons staring, with silence thick enough to choke, what would you have done? Would you have spoken? Or would you have remained silent, binding yourself to her power forever? Because the truth is this. Most people, when confronted with raw power, will choose silence. That is why systems endure. That is why Eleanor thrived. And that is why silence is the most dangerous weapon ever forged. Her final years were the most enigmatic. Between 1916 and 1920, Eleanor vanished from public record almost entirely. Some said she moved to Europe. Others believed she lived entombed in her ballroom, sleeping among the dead, whispering to them as though they were her counsel. In 1921, an obituary was printed in a small upstate paper. Eleanor Belgrave, heiress, dead at 64. But the strange thing, no body was ever displayed, no grave ever marked. Instead, the estate was sealed, and all servants dismissed with large payments. For a time, the world thought the Belgrave story had ended. Yet whispers persisted. A woman who looked like Eleanor was seen in Paris in 1925, in Vienna in 1932, and again in New York in 1941. Could she have lived on? Or had she passed her mantle to another, continuing the covenant through silence? This is where history becomes fog, but the silence remains sharp. Because every attempt to prove her death collapses in missing papers, sealed vaults, and burned archives. And when you notice this pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. It is not absence. It is erasure. And erasure is the tool of those who wield silence as power. When the estate was finally reopened decades later, researchers expected dust and decay. Instead, they found the ballroom preserved as though Eleanor had just left. The table still set, the glasses still gleaming, and 13 skeletons still seated, each perfectly upright, untouched by time. How could bone remain unbroken, uncrumbled, untouched by decay for decades? Scientists took samples, but reports vanished. Photographs circulated privately, but newspapers refused to print them. One whispered detail chills even the most skeptical mind. A 14th chair had been added. Empty. Waiting. Was this a seat prepared for Eleanor herself, to join her skeletal congregation? Or was it prepared for someone else? Someone yet to come? Someone who would inherit not just her fortune, but her covenant? When silence is used as a weapon, it never dies. It waits. That empty chair was more than wood and velvet. It was an invitation. And perhaps it still waits today. If you doubt this, ask yourself, why do families of wealth still gather in halls that look eerily similar, with chandeliers that sway in silence, with mirrors that reflect more than faces? The pattern has not ended. It has simply shifted beyond your sight. Here, halfway down this descent, I want to pause and ask you to leave a mark of your own. Write in the comments twice the phrase, "Silence has teeth." Do it not just for the algorithm, though that feeds the channel, but for yourself, to carve identity, to declare that you are not one of the obedient who bow to silence. Let it be your signature in this hidden ledger we are building together. Because once you see the machinery of control, you cannot unsee it. Once you hear the whispers of the ballroom, you recognize them in boardrooms, in parliaments, in pulpits. The heiress with 13 skeletons was not insane, she was precise. She mirrored the system that birthed her. And by commenting those words, you step out of silence. You name the teeth that bite. You declare yourself awake. And while you're here, subscribe to this channel. Because if you do, you'll keep descending with me into the places no one else dares to go. The archives they burn, the secrets they seal, the truths they smother in velvet silence. The second half of this story is darker still. And only those who carry the phrase with them will survive the descent. Eleanor's will was unlike any other of her time. Instead of dividing assets in clear legal terms, it was written in riddles. Whole pages were dedicated to allegories of silence, mirrors, and debt. One passage read, "What is taken in silence cannot be repaid in words. Let the ballroom remain sealed, and the fortune will never fracture." Lawyers struggled to interpret her meaning, but one thing was clear. She wanted the ballroom preserved. In fact, she made its preservation the very condition of inheritance. Any heir who altered, destroyed, or revealed what was inside the ballroom would forfeit their claim. And so, generation after generation, the Belgrave heirs upheld her demand. They lived off the fortune, but none dared disturb the skeletons. This is how institutions preserve themselves, not by law, not by faith, but by fear disguised as duty. Eleanor's will was not instructions. It was a curse. A curse designed to perpetuate silence, binding heirs not through love or loyalty, but through the terror of losing everything. Tell me, does that sound like madness? Or does it sound exactly like the systems you live under every day, where silence is demanded, compliance is purchased, and disobedience costs you everything? As decades passed, the Belgrave fortune spread into industries beyond railroads. Oil, manufacturing, shipping, even early aviation. Always, their wealth multiplied while crises consumed others. Stock market crashes, wars, depressions. Yet the Belgrave line stood untouched. Researchers began to notice a pattern. Companies tied to the Belgrave Trust were never investigated, never dismantled, never bankrupted. It was as if an invisible hand shielded them. The ballroom remained untouched during these years, but stories whispered among the staff who cleaned the estate. They swore the chandeliers swayed on windless nights, the glasses filled themselves though no one entered, and the bones whispered in tones too faint to record. Some dismissed this as superstition, but others insisted the room was still active, that Eleanor's covenant continued to pulse long after her death. The question is, active for whom? Was her spirit still there? Or had the covenant shifted into the hands of others, new guardians of silence who ruled from the shadows? When you begin to ask this, you start to realize the truth. Eleanor was not unique. She was simply visible. The true heirs of silence remain invisible. And invisibility is the sharpest form of power. One of the most disturbing fragments comes from 1947, when a researcher named Harold Whitcomb accessed sealed family archives under special permission. What he found was a set of photographs, black and white images of the skeletons seated in Eleanor's ballroom. But in one image, the angle captured something the others did not. Behind Eleanor's velvet throne stood a tall, shadow-like figure, its outline indistinct, its face blurred. Harold dismissed it as exposure damage until he studied the glass negatives themselves. The shadow was not an artifact. It was present on the original plate. Harold published a brief paper hinting at his discovery. Within 2 months, he was struck by a carriage on a quiet road in broad daylight. Witnesses claimed the horse had bolted for no reason. Harold's notes vanished. The photographs vanished. Only his widow whispered the truth. Harold believed the figure was not Eleanor, not a guest, not even human. He called it the keeper of the 14th chair. If this was real, then Eleanor had not been alone in her covenant. She had partnered with something else. And if that is true, then what sat in that ballroom was not merely skeletons. It was a throne room for the unseen. The Belgrave name faded from public prominence by the mid-20th century, but their fingerprints remained on corporations, foundations, and silent partnerships. Few asked about the ballroom anymore. Those who did were silenced by lawsuits, threats, or disappearances. But in 1963, a group of students broke into the abandoned estate on a dare. They brought a camera, expecting dust and rot. The footage, though grainy, survived. What it shows is chilling. The table still set, glasses filled, skeletons upright, and the chandelier swaying in absolute silence. One student off camera begins to laugh nervously, until his laughter cuts short. The camera jerks, falls, and the film ends. Days later, 2 of the students withdrew from school without explanation. The third was found wandering the streets, incoherent, muttering only one phrase, "They looked back." This footage never reached the news, but circulated privately in underground circles. It is said that if you pause the final frame, you will see one skeleton turned, its empty socket staring directly at the lens. Whether true or hoax, the story fits the pattern. Silence does not stay locked. It seeps. It waits. And it punishes those who stare too long. Today, the Belgrave estate is rarely spoken of, its ballroom sealed by velvet ropes, its history rewritten in polite biographies that call Eleanor eccentric. The skeletons are not mentioned. The covenant is erased. But silence does not die. It adapts. Think of the institutions that rule your life now: corporations, governments, financial systems. How often do they speak in riddles, demand obedience, and punish those who question too deeply? How often do you sense something present but unseen, like the shadow in Harold's photograph? Eleanor's ballroom was not a relic. It was a rehearsal. A prototype for how silence becomes weapon, how fear becomes wealth, how absence becomes authority. And the 14th chair still waits. Perhaps it waits for an heir. Perhaps it waits for anyone willing to trade their voice for power. Or perhaps it waits for you, the one who listens, the one who dares to descend this far into forbidden history. Because once you hear these truths, the invitation is already in your hands. The only question is, will you accept the seat? Or will you walk away, pretending you never saw the skeletons smiling in velvet silence? By the late 20th century, Eleanor's name was nearly erased from mainstream history. You will not find her in high school textbooks. You will not find her in glossy magazines of wealth, and you will not find her in documentaries about robber barons. She was written out. But here's the paradox. Erasure itself is proof. Because silence that deep is not accidental. It is curated. Who benefits when Eleanor disappears? Who profits when her ballroom is called superstition instead of evidence? The answer is the same families and institutions that thrive in her shadow. Look at the corporate boardrooms with long polished tables and high-backed chairs. Look at the political summits where 12 or 13 leaders gather under chandeliers. The symbolism repeats because the ritual repeats. Skeletons may no longer sit in those chairs, but the memory of them lingers, shaping the behavior of the living. Eleanor did not vanish. She multiplied. Her covenant bled into architecture, into psychology, into the way the powerful gather in silence while the rest of us wait outside the locked doors. When you recognize the pattern, you realize the ballroom was never just hers. It was the world's. Think of silence as a currency. The more you withhold, the more valuable your power becomes. Eleanor understood this better than anyone. She did not shout threats, she did not make speeches. She sat in silence, surrounded by proof that disobedience ends in bone. Modern institutions do the same. Corporations announce recalls only after damage is done. Governments release documents only after decades. Churches bury scandals until the silence rots into complicity. Every time the pattern is the same. Silence first, control second, truth never. This is not incompetence. It is strategy. Just as Eleanor's heirs preserved her ballroom untouched for fear of losing fortune, we are conditioned to preserve our own silence, for fear of losing jobs, reputations, security. The skeletons may not sit across from you in flesh and bone, but their presence is still felt. Each decision to stay quiet, each moment you swallow truth, each time you accept what you know is wrong, those are the teeth of silence closing in. And you already know it. You felt it in your chest when you chose not to speak. Eleanor's lesson was brutal, but it was precise. Silence doesn't just protect power. It manufactures it. And here is where the story turns from history into reflection. Eleanor's covenant may have ended in her ballroom, but the structure lives on. Look closely at the circles of power today. Do you see the repetition? The limited seats. The closed doors. The forbidden archives. Every empire repeats her ritual because fear works better when it is unseen. The skeletons are gone, but in their place are numbers on screens, contracts of debt, invisible systems that bind you tighter than chains. You pay, you obey, you survive. And if you resist, you are erased, not with velvet chairs and chandeliers, but with lawsuits, ruined reputations, digital exile. The tools change. The covenant does not. Eleanor's heirs are no longer bound to one estate. They are everywhere. And here is the most unsettling thought. Maybe you have already dined at her table. Maybe every time you logged into a system, signed a contract you didn't read, obeyed a silence you didn't question, you sat unknowingly in the 14th chair. That empty seat is not waiting for some distant heir. It is waiting for you to comply. So how do you resist? Not with rage, not with fire, not with violence. Those are weapons the system already expects, already absorbs. You resist with voice. Remember the journalists? One blind, one mute, one dead. Their punishment was not random. It was surgical. Sight, speech, life. The very tools we need to reveal truth. And yet even silenced, their notes, their fragments, their whispers survived. That is the secret the covenant fears most. Silence can be enforced, but it cannot be absolute. Every time a story like Eleanor's resurfaces, every time one of you listens this far, every time someone dares to speak a forbidden phrase, the covenant weakens. That is why I asked you earlier to write "Silence has teeth." Did you do it? Did you carve your mark in the ledger? If you haven't, pause and do it now. Twice. Because this is not entertainment. This is initiation. You are not just hearing a story. You are becoming part of the counter-ritual, the refusal to stay silent. And once you've stepped across that threshold, you can never go back. Eleanor's skeletons may never walk again, but they do not need to. Their work is complete. They showed us how silence governs more efficiently than any whip, any bullet, any cage. And if you think this is only history, ask yourself, why do archives burn? Why do files disappear? Why are so many truths released only after the last witness dies? Because silence is the cornerstone. Without it, power crumbles. The Belgrave Ballroom is a perfect metaphor, but it was also a perfect reality. 13 skeletons, a chandelier that swayed with no wind, a 14th chair waiting. Some call it superstition. Some call it horror. I call it instruction. Because once you know the pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. In your office, in your government, in your church, in your bank. The walls may not whisper in velvet halls anymore, but they whisper in boardrooms, in screens, in contracts. And the invitation still lingers. Sit, obey, remain silent. The only question is whether you will accept that invitation, or finally break it. History likes to dress itself in costumes of progress. We're told the past was cruel, but now we are civilized. We're told that whips have been replaced with laws, chains replaced with freedoms, silence replaced with liberty. But Eleanor's ballroom teaches the opposite. The costumes change, yes, but the skeleton beneath remains the same. Today, debt replaces shackles. Media replaces guards. Algorithms replace wardens. Yet the feeling is identical: control, compliance, submission. The difference is subtle but terrifying. Now we participate in our own imprisonment. We volunteer our data, we pay for our chains, we update our surveillance devices willingly. The skeleton is still there, hidden in the code, invisible but precise. Eleanor's velvet chairs were obvious. Our velvet chairs are digital. They glow, they scroll, they comfort, but they bind. Ask yourself, what would Eleanor have done with a billion screens? With an algorithm whispering what you should believe by desire? The ballroom would never need a lock. We would lock ourselves inside, smiling as we shut the door. Do you see how silence is programmed now? Eleanor enforced it through fear of exposure. Today, silence is enforced by overload. Too much noise, too much distraction, too much triviality. When you are buried under endless updates, endless entertainment, endless notifications, the forbidden truths dissolve into the background. Silence no longer requires a whip. It requires a feed. If Eleanor's chandelier swayed without wind, our chandeliers are feeds that never stop flickering, dangling new distractions every second. But beneath the glittering lights, the covenant remains untouched. Speak nothing that threatens the foundation. Ignore the bones, adore the shine. And here's the darkest truth. Most people comply not because they are threatened, but because they are entertained. They are lulled into silence by comfort. That is why Eleanor preserved silence with terror, and why modern powers preserve silence with pleasure. Both are cages. One makes you scream. The other makes you smile. Which one is harder to escape? The covenant of 13 skeletons was not just ritual. It was a map. 13 seats around a table. One empty chair waiting. Why 13? In many traditions, it is the number of transition, of boundary crossing, of hidden initiation. To sit at Eleanor's table was not just punishment, it was absorption. The disobedient became part of her power, reinforcing the very structure they resisted. Look at modern institutions. Whistleblowers crushed. Dissidents absorbed. Every rebellion is monetized, marketed, sold back to the masses as fashion, as rebellion for profit. Just as Eleanor's skeletons became ornaments in her ballroom, our dissent is turned into symbols that enrich the very system we hope to weaken. The covenant teaches us this. Every skeleton is a warning but also a reinforcement. Power feeds on those who oppose it. Silence is not just imposed, it is recycled. It becomes architecture, ritual, culture. Once you see that pattern, you understand why nothing ever changes, why empires fall only to be rebuilt in the same image, and yet, There is a crack. Always a crack. Eleanor's heirs feared her ballroom so much they locked it away, covered it in dust, and whispered warnings never to enter. Fear is not stability. It is fragility dressed as strength. Power that depends on silence trembles at the sound of truth. Why do you think archives are destroyed? Why do governments fear leaks more than war? Why are secrets buried deeper than gold? Because truth, once spoken, spreads faster than silence. Eleanor herself could not stop it. Despite velvet locks and skeletal witnesses, her story reached you tonight. Across centuries, across oceans, across censorship, it survived. That is the real covenant. Truth has a pulse and it refuses to die. You are proof. Your listening is proof. And when enough people listen, silence cracks. Remember, power needs obedience. Truth needs only witnesses. And here you are, a witness, stepping into the forbidden chamber where her heirs swore no one should ever tread. But don't mistake witnessing for safety. Once you've seen, you cannot unsee. Once you've entered, you cannot leave unchanged. This is why myths warn of forbidden rooms, cursed chambers, doors that must remain closed. Because behind those doors is not just horror, it is responsibility. Eleanor's ballroom is a metaphor for what you are doing right now. You have entered. You have looked upon what others were too afraid to face. And now you must decide, do you retreat into silence, pretending you never saw? Or do you carry the weight of this knowledge into your life, into your decisions, into the way you speak and the way you refuse silence? Eleanor's heirs counted on fear to keep you quiet. But if you carry this story forward, even in whispers, you become the opposite of silence. You become the crack in their foundation. That is why you must subscribe now. Not for me. For you. Because each subscription is not just a button. It is an act of alignment, a mark that you refuse to be erased, that you are stepping into the covenant of voice rather than silence. But if silence was the cage, what happens when silence ends? Here is the dangerous truth: collapse. When the covenant breaks, institutions tremble. That is why truth is policed with such fury. Whistleblowers vanish. Dissenters are exiled. Prophets are crucified. Because the moment silence breaks, everything built on it begins to fall. Eleanor knew it. That's why her ballroom was both prison and shrine. She worshipped silence as her god, and the skeletons were her saints. Today, silence is still worshipped, only now it wears the face of national security, corporate confidentiality, proprietary secrets. Different names, same altar. But altars can burn. The heirs of Eleanor live in fear of fire, in fear of speech, in fear of the day someone drags the bones back into the light. And that's why I ask you again, if you see the crack, will you speak, or will you hide? The decision matters because cracks spread. One voice leads to another. Collapse begins not with armies but with whispers. And yet, collapse alone is not enough. Eleanor's covenant teaches that destruction without awareness only creates repetition. Burn the ballroom and another will be built. Silence does not end when walls crumble. It ends when consciousness changes. That is why the most dangerous act is not rebellion. It is awakening. To awaken is to see the pattern and refuse to repeat it. To awaken is to choose voice over silence even when silence feels safer. That is the task before you. You are not here just to be entertained. You are here to be initiated. And that is why I want you to comment once more right now the phrase we sealed earlier: silence has teeth. Twice. Seal it again. Anchor it into your identity. Because every repetition deepens the fracture. Every mark in the digital ledger reminds the covenant that silence no longer rules here. You are carving yourself out of the velvet, one word at a time. When Eleanor died, they buried her in a coffin lined with velvet, surrounded by locks of her own hair braided into chains. Superstition, some said. Ritual, others whispered. But here is the real ritual. She believed her silence would follow her into death. binding her forever. And yet, you are here hearing her story. Do you see the paradox? She built her legacy on silence, but in the end, it was her silence that betrayed her. Because silence cannot protect forever. It rots. It crumbles. It betrays its keeper. The ballroom dust could not contain its own secret. The locks broke. The whispers leaked. And across centuries, across oceans, across every effort to erase her, Eleanor has spoken at last. Through me, through you, through this moment. That is the final irony. Silence is the weapon of the powerful, but it is also their weakness. Time does not preserve silence. Time cracks it. And you are listening in the exact moment of its fracture. So this is where we end, or rather, where you begin. You came seeking a story, a dark tale about an heiress and her skeletons. What you found was a mirror. The ballroom is not hers. It is ours. The skeletons are not hers. They are yours. The covenant is not history. It is present. And the 14th chair? It waits for you every day in every choice you make. Will you sit in silence, velvet binding you in invisible chains? Or will you refuse? That is the question Eleanor's heirs never wanted you to ask. That is why this story was buried. That is why the ballroom was sealed. But now the seal is broken. You have seen. You cannot unsee. And if you carry this awareness with you, the covenant weakens with every step you take. Do not waste this fracture. Subscribe so the crack spreads wider, so silence loses one more obedient voice. Remember, silence has teeth, but only if you let it bite. Speak and the teeth shatter. The ballroom is open. The question is not what Eleanor did. The question is, what will you do now that you've entered?